Thank you, Dr. Federley, for that very beautiful music. My wife, who is about 4 feet over to my left, was humming throughout your playing of that, and we found it, both of us, very touching and moving. Thank you, Mignon and Geraldine, for your warm introduction to our service. Today we light our chalice flame in the name of hope, and for the people who down through the years have carried the light of hope for others and represented light in dark and difficult times, and specifically for the light which shined very brightly in the life and teachings of Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. With the passing of years, I have developed an ever deepening appreciation of the life, teaching, and work of Reverend Martin Luther King. When I think what he represented and the context in which he represented it, I am moved to the point of awe and feel deeply appreciative for his witness to the truth in the face of raw racism, hatred, and widespread misunderstanding. Reverend King was in the center of a vast social movement, but he was not a solitary actor creating and making history himself, but rather there were people around him from the beginning and all through his days who were indispensable to his work. Furthermore, Reverend King stood in the line of a very long line of Black leaders and ordinary people who had stood up against racial injustice and stood up for civil rights. Reverend King was at the center of a crest of a wave of many social influences, but to be sure, he was a stellar and remarkable voice for truth and justice at a critical moment when his words could find an audience. One can view Reverend King from many different perspectives as a pioneer in the practice of nonviolent resistance in America, a teaching took from Gandhi in India. Or it can be looked upon as a catalyst for social change, or as an artist who used words creatively. I am a drum major for justice, he would say on many an occasion. He could be viewed as a leader who teaches us what leadership means, as a coalition builder who sought to build bridges between many divisions within the Black community and between the Black and the white community. One can look at him as a trailblazer in understanding white supremacy. His letter from the Birmingham jail is surely one of the beginning writings that point towards a deepening understanding of what white supremacy is. We could look upon him as one of those very rare persons who seeks to raise the functioning of an entire society to a higher level in a manner in which is similar to Gandhi. One could look at him in terms of a drama of unbelievable pathos in which he dealt relentlessly with a force of hatred and misunderstanding directed toward him. Or one could study him and look at him as a story of the audacity of hope, He had no money, no military, no real political power. He was a black man in a white man's world. He felt a constant barrage of hatred, and yet he found ways to create the leverage of power against those in power. Assassinated at age 39, he had accomplished enough for 100 lifetimes. And there are many ways to view him. And today I would like to view Reverend King as a religious prophet who called this country back to its genuine and true roots in its principles and core values, and used those values as a framework in which he did his work. And in a moment, I will continue with that line of inquiry. And now may we turn back to Mignon. Thank you very, very much, Emily. I love that story, and I love the drawings. Incredibly vivid and creative. Kudos to the creator of the visuals on that. Reverend King saw America's flaws very clearly. He experienced them directly. But he also saw America's greatness, at least potentially. And again in his speeches and in his life, he would point to the horrific problems of racism and injustice in America, and at the same time, point to the fact that our country, at least theoretically, was based on very precious ideals that in a way, in a certain sense, supported his work and gave him the context that enabled him to say, I am in the right, I am in harmony with our country's true values. Reverend King, of course, started his career and his work confronting racism. And this period of his life culminated in the I Have a Dream speech of August the 28th, 1963. In the speech, he said, 50 years ago, a great American signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope. But 100 years later, he wrote, the Negro still is not free, is still languishing in the corners of American society. So we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which came back marked insufficient funds. Reverend King then goes on to express hope after this critique. But we refuse, he wrote, to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Reverend King called upon America in these words, as he did again and again, to align with its core principles. And he expresses faith and hope that that is indeed possible. Reverend King had an extraordinary opportunity given to very, very few people. And that is that he was able to tour the country and speak in rural settings, in academic settings, to a wide diversity of people of all races, backgrounds, and cultures. And from that multifaceted experience, he created in his own mind over time a comprehensive understanding of our society, not our society in the fantasy of advertising, or not the version of our society which politicians trumpet, but the reality of our country and its problems. Over time, without leaving his campaign for racial justice, for voting justice, for equality behind, but rather pulling them forward into a much larger vision, his work became, I believe, historic in scope to bring America in its total culture and society back into alignment with its core principles. This broadening of his vision was evident when, on April the 4th, 1967, Reverend King spoke at the Riverside Church in New York City and came out against the Vietnam War. In doing this, he alienated large numbers of white politicians who had supported him, such as LBJ, and he even alienated people in his own Black community who wanted his devotion and attention to be purely on civil rights. So in the midst of being severely criticized for this broadening attack or critique on our culture, King went ahead. He was beginning to see the connections between all the major problems in our society, and he could not hold back from bringing attention to it. He wrote in that speech, "I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in the rehabilitation of its poor community, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such." He pointed out the moral contradictions of the Vietnam War, which were plain for all to see, but no one was seeing, and fewer still were pointing a finger at it. He wrote, "We are taking young Black men who have been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberty in Southeast Asia, which has not been found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have repeatedly been faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools." Another step in broadening the critique of Reverend King's examination of our society came just a year before his assassination. In December of 1967, Reverend King announced the plan to bring poor people from across the country for a new march on Washington. Just as his position on the Vietnam War had been controversial, so was his Poor People's Campaign, even controversial within the civil rights movement. King's support within the Black community and within the white community was eroding almost by the month during the last 18 years of his life. But he kept on with a moral vision he had seen. In his last Sunday sermon, Reverend King stated, "We are coming to Washington in a poor people's campaign. Yes, we are going to bring the tired, the poor, the huddled masses, We are coming to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty. We are coming to ask America to be true to the large promissory note that was signed years ago. And we are coming to engage in dramatic, nonviolent action to call attention to the gulf between promise and fulfillment, to make the invisible visible. Reverend King, during the last 2 years of his life, most definitely, and before, but certainly the last 2 years of his life, saw clearly the links between racism, white supremacy, poverty, the flawed priorities of our government spending, social injustice, and the use of race by politicians to accumulate and maintain power by pitting one group of people against the other, by scaring people into hating other people. Reverend King's prophetic role did not make him popular. A year before his assassination, 75% of the American public disapproved of him. That means, given the proportion and the percentage of the Black community at the time, that means approximately 90% of the white population disapproved of him. Today, we live in a society in which all of the issues Reverend King spoke about have come to full flower. After the Second War, the American government moved away from the trajectory which Franklin Delano Roosevelt had laid out to the American people over a period of years so clearly. And it became more and more engrossed in being the dominant political and military power in the world, and absorbing in the process more and more of its resources, talents, and energies into that mechanism. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned of this very phenomenon. Reverend King took on, towards the end of his life, a mammoth project to encourage society to disengage from its erroneous course struck out after the Second World War. In the Riverside Church speech I quoted from earlier, Reverend King said, "Vietnam is the symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if left untreated, if the malady continued to fester, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight." Reverend King's prophecies came to full flower on January 6th of this year, as white supremacist forces supported what was in effect an attempt at a coup in a spirit of fascism. Though Reverend King's call to return to this nation's core creed and principles were largely ignored after his death, mercifully, we are now on track, it appears, to be moving back towards the vision of society which Reverend King gave his life for. Today, I hear Reverend King's spirit in the actions and words of Reverend Barber, of Repairers of the Breach, a minister from your own state of North Carolina. We live in perilous times, but perhaps one of the most valuable lessons of Reverend King is to follow him when he did not fall into despair or apathy in the face of great challenges, but maintained hope. There's a line, I believe, of historical continuity connecting Reverend King, FDR, and Lincoln. All called us to the better angels of our nature and a return to our republic's core principles. For this, Reverend King was hated by many and misunderstood by most, and ultimately killed for. Reverend King died for the sins of America. Let me end with some quotes from Reverend King, and let him have the last word. Reverend King wrote, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And he lived that. Reverend King said, "The ultimate measure of a person is not where he or she stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands at times of challenge and controversy." And he lived that. Reverend King said, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he or she must take it because conscience tells him or her it is right." And he lived that. Reverend King said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." And he lived that. And Reverend King also said, finally, "You can kill the dreamer, but you cannot kill the dream." May it be so. Amen. And may we now turn back to Geraldine. I would like to again express my deepest thanks and appreciation to all of those people who make these services possible, both those in front of the camera who do a magnificent job week after week, and those behind the camera who make it all possible and do a marvelous job also and do their work with great dedication. I'd like to share a reading from Dr. King for the extinguishing of the chalice and the benediction. And as we extinguish our chalice, I believe, Reverend King wrote, that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final say and the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. And he lived that. And for our benediction, I share another reading from Reverend King. Faith is the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. Amen. And now may we return to Geraldine.